ServiceNow based in Detroit. Thank you all very much for joining this morning. This morning we're going to be talking about asset lifecycle management and automated discovery. Just a few points of logistics before we get going. Because we've had such large turnouts to these WebExes, these webinars, we're going to keep everyone muted today, but we definitely would appreciate any interaction, any questions that you might have. Please do type those into the chat window within the WebEx console, and we will follow up, sending out written responses to any and all questions that we receive. We will also be sending a link to the recording, so you can have a recorded WebEx as well. This webinar is the third in a series of webinars really designed to introduce ServiceNow and some key ServiceNow concepts. If you tuned in for the previous two, you know that we have been kind of framing it up in these three areas of transformation. These are areas that we've seen our customers derive significant value, transformative value from the use of ServiceNow. And those three areas are consolidation, bringing everything, all IT processes, number of disparate tools onto a single system of record that is ServiceNow. Consumerization, which is providing a familiar, intuitive user interface to both IT and to end users that feels a lot more like Amazon.com and less like standing in line at the Secretary of State. And finally, automation. This includes automation of tasks and approvals, but it can also include the automation of work within our customers' data centers. The great thing about asset management and discovery that we're going to be talking about today is that it pulls together all three of these areas of transformation. Just a little bit of background on the way that we see asset management. Oftentimes, people have different ideas of what asset management actually is, but for the purposes of our talk today, we're going to be thinking about asset management as a set of business practices that join financial, contractual, and inventory functions with a goal of supporting both lifecycle management of those assets and strategic decision-making for IT in the business. The process by which we're going to follow is management of physical and licensed, that is, software licensed assets from acquisition to disposition. People often talk about this as the chain of custody, being able to track an asset from the time that somebody requested it until the time that it was finally disposed of. The really interesting thing about asset management, at least for me, is that it allows for IT, procurement, finance, contracts, vendor management, asset recovery, all to work together and to communicate in a similar way that ITIL allows for the communication within IT service management. So why do we do it? Why is it important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons. There are cost and contract ramifications of not managing our assets. It helps us, doing asset management well helps us to avoid costly write-offs that might hit the company's bottom line, make sure that we're in compliance with our vendors' contractual relationships, make sure that we're not overbuying our software licenses and that we're harvesting software licenses from hardware that might be getting decommissioned. It helps us control corporate and personal data, comply with industry and environmental standards. Also helps us to ensure that the correct productivity software is installed on users' desktops and laptops, and ensures that the correct software and patches are installed on servers so that those applications run appropriately. So those are just some of the many reasons why asset management is important. Many of you have probably seen this slide before. This gives you a view into the sum total of applications that are built on the ServiceNow platform. Today we're going to be focusing in on sort of the bottom left: configuration, CMDB, discovery, and asset management. But these are just a few of the many applications that are built on this single consolidated system of record. If we want to think about these in a little more detail, today we're going to be focusing on a number of ServiceNow modules that really work together to support asset management. This includes the service catalog, the product catalog. It includes our procurement and contract management applications, certainly automated discovery and orchestration. All of these work together to support both software asset management and hardware asset management, or asset management in general. And today we're primarily going to be focusing in on the modules that you see here in red. So without any more slides, I'm going to move right into the demo. And we're going to start in the same place that we see asset management starting. Certainly this is not the only spot, but it's a very common spot for the asset lifecycle to begin. And this is with the user request. What we're looking at right now is our self-service portal. This is the end user view of ServiceNow. It's designed to be very familiar and intuitive and look like the kind of technology that our end users use in their personal lives. If I click on this order things link, I'm taken to a list of the items that a user could order from the service catalog. These include hardware and software and other types of services. I'm going to navigate directly to what we call an order guide, which helps expedite the process of a new employee onboarding. So in this use case, we have a new employee. His name is Joe. Joe is going to be working in the development department as a title of director. And Joe needs a few pieces of equipment and other things to get ready for his new job. So Joe's going to order an iPhone, some business cards, and the asset, which is going to be the laptop, which is appropriate for the development environment. From here, I click Choose Options, and this pre-populates a shopping cart for Joe with the appropriate development laptop and the other items that we selected. Here you can see Joe is able to configure the asset and also see some indication of what effect that configuration has on the overall price. So as Joe selects a larger hard drive, he realizes, or he is notified, that it costs a little bit more. Notice that this laptop also has, in addition to the one-time price, it has a recurring price of $50 per month. So in our service catalog, you're able to define the single upfront cost as well as the recurring cost and the frequency of that recurring cost. Now, Joe would be able to configure each one of these individual items, the iPhone 5 and the business cards, as you'd expect. Each one of them has its own set of configuration options that Joe can select. But when Joe finishes, he can go ahead and check out, and he's presented with what looks like a confirmation of the different things that Joe's going to be ordering. And notice these are grouped in two groups. The top are the items that are associated with the recurring cost, and the bottom is the one-time cost. In this view, Joe can make a few changes before he finally submits the order. And in a very similar looking form, he gets the confirmation of the individual items that he's ordered, including all the prices, expected delivery dates, etc. Now, each one of these items has its own workflow behind. As you can imagine, an iPhone 5 would have a different set of steps for the ordering, the approvals, the fulfillment, the configuration than a set of business cards would. Each one of these items is tied to a workflow within the ServiceNow workflow editor, and that's what drives these individual stages for the item. As you can imagine, the first step could very well be some approval, and Joe's manager, in this case, is responsible for approving. Joe's manager can launch ServiceNow within his iPad and can navigate right to his approval queue. Notice that this is a full version of the ServiceNow application, but in this case, we're going to be looking at just the approvals. So let's open that up. Here's the one that Joe just entered. We click on the actual approval request. He can look at all of the items that Joe's asking for. Here's the iPhone 5. You can even see the configuration for these items. In this case, it was an 80 gigabyte hard drive with Windows XP. If it all looks good, Joe's manager can go ahead and approve. And the item, the request, now gets sent along the process. You can imagine that this would potentially be sent, this request will potentially be sent to the procurement people to order some of these items, and that's where we're going to be heading next. So here, I'm going to switch over to the IT view of ServiceNow. So we're no longer looking at the end user view, we're looking at something that somebody inside of IT, or in this case procurement, might see. And we're looking at the procurement dashboard. This is a dashboard from our procurement application that gives me the ability to see, when I say me, I'm speaking of somebody working in procurement, the ability to see all the open requests for this department. Incidentally, there's some other charts that you can see, orders by vendor and expenditures and purchase orders. We're going to be focusing right in on this request. So if I click in, you'll see that we provide a list of the requested items. On the related list, we can see the approvers. In this case, Rob Phillips, who is Joe's manager, has already approved. And upon approving, the workflow automatically generates a task that would also be assigned to the procurement department. And this task is what instructs procurement on what to do next. In this case, source the items that have been requested. So again, as the procurement agent, I'm going to click here on source request. This will bring up a small dialog that lets me decide where these individual items are going to be sourced from. And also asks me to pick a location for the destination. We'll just pick the first one here, San Diego border. That's where the items are going to be sent to. Here are the individual items that are part of the request, the iPhone 5 and the development laptop. Now, I have two choices of where to get these devices, these assets. They could be coming from an internal warehouse or a stockroom. In that case, I would be able to see where those were located. And if I select one of these, like the San Diego warehouse, I'll immediately get an indication of how many are in stock at that warehouse. We allow organizations to track the stock in different locations and then to be able to decrement the stock upon ordering them. If, however, I needed to order this laptop from a vendor, I would be able to see, or be able to click on Create PO, and then select the vendor from which I'm going to place the order, in this case from IBM. So just to summarize, I've opened up the individual request. I've navigated to a task that was part of the request. I've figured out for each of the items on the request where that item would be sourced from and the destination that those items will be shipped to. From here, I'll click OK, and this is all I need to do to source those items or to begin the sourcing process, let's say. Because for the item that's going to be ordered, we have a little bit of a purchase order process that we need to follow. In this case, a purchase order number here is automatically generated. This could be done within ServiceNow, or it could be done by an integration to a purchasing system, such as Ariba or PeopleSoft or Oracle. But we build one internally. For the purposes of this example, we built one internally. And here's where I can define the shipping and payment terms for the device. There's perhaps a cost, maybe $50. I could go ahead and set that up, and when I feel like it's configured properly, it's filled out properly, I can go ahead and click order. Now, in the background, you can imagine that clicking order would do a couple of perhaps different things. It could generate a task, a new task for procurement to go out and enter an order in the vendor's ordering system. Perhaps it sends an email to my local account rep and says, I need another one of these laptops, and here's the PO. But this could be another integration point to another process or to another system. Next, you can imagine after the ordering, the next is the receiving. And one thing that you might want to do in between those two is to actually create the asset in the ServiceNow asset repository prior to delivery. If I click this link, I will create an asset stub within our asset management system that's going to make it easier for the receiving individuals, the people on the receiving dock, to receive the item. And that, in fact, is the actual next step So I'm going to go ahead and click Receive. This will bring up another small dialog that allows me to specify, yes, in fact, we did receive it at the San Diego border or wherever we're receiving this item to. I can select that I've received it and the quantity. Since this is an asset, I might want to go ahead and use my barcode scanner to populate in an asset tag and a serial number. And I can enter those here. And when I click OK, that will be added to the asset record for this ordered asset. Now, as part of this purchase order, here's the asset. And if I drill into that asset, if I navigate to that asset record, notice what I have in front of me is the chain of custody for this asset. I'll click on this one. Because what I've been able to do since I've tracked this all through ServiceNow, I can see the originating request, I can see the purchase order line, I can see the receiving line or the receiver that I got when the device arrived on the loading dock. I can also see some other information related to that asset lifecycle, like the disposal. When it comes time to take this asset out of service, I can define why it was disposed of, who was the beneficiary, if there was a resale associated, I can track all those here. So there's the cradle to grave for the entire asset lifecycle. Incidentally, I can also track things like depreciation on the asset, calculating its cost over its useful lifetime, if there were contracts that were associated, maintenance contracts, service contracts, etc. I could track those on the same asset record. Finally, as the asset is ready to be deployed into the environment, this is where I can track the actual ownership of the environment. I'll just give you a quick look what that might look like. But right now it's showing up as in stock. As it moves into use, you'll see that the assigned to or the intended for changes to be assigned to, and now Joe employee is going to be assigned this asset. If I were somebody that were working in the field services area or maybe in the desktop area, just save this one real quick. I might actually want to have my own dashboard that showed me the work that I needed to get done to help fulfill this request. This is a dashboard that shows me the ongoing computer refresh and deployment activities within my environment. I can see a couple of work queues that I've set up, deployment preparation. These are the laptops that need to be configured for their initial boot up, maybe some software installed, maybe some configuration. And then these are the ones that ultimately need to be delivered out to the field. Now this process that we just showed from request through fulfillment works for both hardware and software assets. You can imagine that the software asset process is slightly different because we're essentially going to be entitling individuals to assets. And then we're going to want to be able to reconcile those entitlements to what's installed in the environment. And that installation is what is going to be discovered using our automated discovery. Automated discovery is capable of discovering both hardware and software assets in the environment. We'll look at how it works and how the software is actually reconciled against the entitlement. But before I do that, I just want to show you how those entitlements can then be displayed in a reconciliation report that shows me the software that's been ordered and purchased and the contractual rights to the software, and it compares that to the software that's been actually discovered within the environment. So in this case, you see in green are the software packages where we have sufficient licenses. The orange is where we're getting close to exceeding the contractual entitlements we have to the license, and then the red is where we've exceeded the use of that license. In this case, you can see that we have rights to 550, and we've actually installed 584. These installations are discovered using ServiceNow Automated Discovery, and that's where we're going to next. I'd like to talk about the discovery architecture because it gives you an idea, it gives everyone an idea about how discovery works. There's often questions because we are a cloud-based solution. How do we actually do discovery? The secret component, well, perhaps not so secret, but the enabling component is what we call the mid server. It's this management, instrumentation, and discovery server that sits in our customer's data center and really becomes the hands and feet for ServiceNow within the data center. Being the hands and feet, it doesn't really have a brain in the sense that it doesn't do any processing. But what it does is make outgoing connections to the ServiceNow instance and receives its commands, takes those commands, executes them in the data center, and then replies back to the instance for processing. As I mentioned, it makes outgoing commands only. It doesn't listen on any port. So typically there's no changes to corporate firewalls that need to be made. All communication is initiated by the mid server using secure HTTPS. We like to talk about this discovery happening in 4 phases or 4 sweeps. And those actually have names. So once you configure a mid server, give it a range of IP addresses and credentials, it does its discovery in 4 main sweeps. The first one we call Shazam, and that is our way of scanning all of the IP addresses that are in the ranges that have been specified, and essentially looking for anything that might be listening or connected to that IP address. The next phase is called classification, and that's where we figure out what exactly is there on that IP address. Is it a Windows device? Is it a Linux device? Is it a network device? Next step is identification. Identification compares what's discovered on the device so far and figures out whether or not it already exists within the configuration management database. And finally, exploration is the last step. It's the more detailed interrogation of that device to discover its physical configuration, disk configuration, software installed, and ultimately dependencies between that software and other software packages in the environment. Let's just take a look at how this is configured. And discovery is configured really in 3 main ways. 3 things need to be in place. The first one is the mid server. And again, the mid is that piece of software in the data center that's doing the discovery. You define a mid server, you define its location and what types of activities you want it to do. And this is just showing you a list of those mid servers. You can see that 2 of them are down, but 1 is up and running, up and active, doing its discovery work. You can have as many mid servers in your environment as you like. And the number of mid servers is really just a function of your network topology and your security architecture, as well as any kind of loading and performance considerations you might have with the discovery. The next thing that has to be configured in order for discovery to work is the credentials. These are the credentials that discovery is going to use to interrogate the environment at a more detailed level. Now, it just so happens that the Windows credentials are stored locally on the Windows server where our mid server is installed. The mid server on a Windows server will use credentials that it inherits from the domain security, and it typically needs a local admin, a domain account with local admin privileges in order to run. All the other credentials are stored in the cloud and encrypted with our security. And those are credentials for things like SSH, that's used for Linux and Unix discovery, SNMP, which is used for your network devices, as well as your vCenter credentials that are used for your vCenter virtual machine discovery. The last area that needs to be configured in order for discovery to run is the discovery schedule. And this is where we define our IP address ranges and the frequency of discovery. You can see here that we've selected a mid server called SCLab NOAM MID. We've configured a frequency, namely daily. This is going to run each day. And we've also configured the range of IP addresses that this discovery is going to include. And you can see we specify this in subnet notation. Once that's all configured, you can actually execute a discovery manually, or you can let it run based on the schedule. And each time discovery runs, it's going to create a record within the discovery application. You can see that there's a couple of these that are currently running and a number that have already completed. Let's drill into one that's completed and just look at some of the data. Of course, you get some timestamp information and some status information. If I look down just a little farther into the related list, you can see that the discovery log is showing me all of the individual steps that were included in the discovery. If I click on discovery timeline, you're going to see those 4 sweeps or 4 phases of the discovery represented in a graphical way. And you'll notice that for each of these phases, there are 2 steps. You can see here's the Shazam sweep, here's the classify sweep, here's the identify sweep, and then down here is the exploration sweep. These 2 steps are what we call probes and sensors. And if I hover over, you can see the name. This says probe Shazam. Our probe is how we define the way that we're going to interrogate the environment. The sensor is the way that we're going to process the information that we've retrieved. There are 2 ways of defining how we're going to go get the data and what we're going to do with that data when it finally comes back to the ServiceNow instance. By hovering over these, you can get an idea about how long they take to execute and the relationship between the 2 probes and sensors and the different phases. It's really helpful when you're initially setting up discovery. If I come back to my discovery status, you can see here are the devices that we have discovered. These are the CIs that have been created. Notice that a number of these, in fact, all of these, were already within the configuration management database. And if you look at the completed activity, you see that the CI was in fact updated. If I click into one of these, this is the actual CI record, ESX prod. If I drill in, you'll see the CI that was updated as part of this discovery. Notice on the right-hand side, you see where it says issues. If there was any problem with the actual discovery, you would see that in a link that you could click in and see what the details might have been. Let's just take a quick look at the actual CI record. This may look familiar to some of you, but it's essentially the technical information about the configuration item. So this is an ESX server called ESX prod. It has a serial number and a model number. It's got some an operating system installed. You might have some information about that operating system. You can see the CPU manufacturer, etc. Here's where we also are able to display the dependencies between this configuration item and other configuration items or business services in the environment. And oftentimes it's easier to look at this in our business service map, which displays that information in a graphical way. Scroll down a little bit, you can see here's the original CI that we started with, this ESX server, and you can see the related VMware CIs that perhaps are riding on this ESX server that are hosted on this ESX server. You can see there are 18 or 19 VMware virtual machine instances. You can also see in this view there's some templates that are installed on that ESX server. You can look upstream even further and see which business services or applications are dependent on that virtual infrastructure. So all of these dependencies are built out through the discovery process by both interrogating the vCenter environment as well as interrogating each one of the guest operating systems and looking at processes that are running and what other processes and servers those processes are talking to. I think I'll come back from here to our original discovery view and just talk about a couple of other little things. As I mentioned, the configurations for actually doing the discovery and processing the discovery is done by our probes and sensors, and this is managed within this probes and sensors list. The great thing about it is that it's extensible, which means if you have a custom application, a home-built application, if you want to design your own way of populating data into the CMDB or the asset repository, you can write your own probes and sensors. And this is completely open in the sense that you can see all the ones that we've written, and you can use those as examples for maybe some custom-built probes and sensors. There's many, many, many that we include in the base product you can see. And these give you a great leg up into creating your own if you decide to do that. The last thing I'll talk about, because we talked about the software asset management application and how that's populated, is the idea of discovery models. And what this discovery model does is it's a way that ServiceNow takes software packages that are discovered and captures information about those packages and allows the normalization of those software titles and alignment of those titles to a software model or a software product. So let's just look at one that's probably familiar to everybody. If I look at this Adobe system, and we'll look do one more filter here to look at just the Adobe Acrobat 9. Because what happens when you discover applications, software titles in the environment, you're going to oftentimes see that these are different versions. They might even have differing names, but they all align to the same software model or the same software package that you have entitlements or contractual entitlements towards. And we want to be able to normalize that information so that we're counting these properly. And we do that with what we're calling our software discovery model. This is how we map these different versions of Adobe Acrobat. In this case, you can see 9.0, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3. They're all really aligned to an Adobe Systems Acrobat 9.0 license that we've purchased. So our discovery models allow you to take those discovered titles, normalize them to a package, and then our software compliance engine will be able to compare those to the entitlements you have by virtue of your contracts. Well, I've come up to the end of my 30 minutes. Just as a quick recap, we looked at the software and hardware asset lifecycle, beginning with the request, tracking it through procurement and receipt, and ultimately deployment and disposition. We talked about how ServiceNow can provide a single repository to view and manage that entire chain of custody. We talked about how our automated discovery can populate both the asset and configuration management applications for tracking hardware as well as for tracking software titles. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you all very soon. Have a great week and a great weekend.